I feel like the most common question people are going to have with this piece is, I liked it, but what the heck did it mean?
It meant to whatever you think it meant.
Which is funny because we need to talk about the irony of that. All right, welcome to the CodeX Cantina, where I am Una.
And I am Foghorn Leghorn.
All right, we are going to be going into heavy detail, bringing out some analysis and interpretations on short stories. Today we are doing Ray Bradbury's The Foghorn. If you are down for literature discussion, please consider subscribing to join us on this journey.
You can read this for free. It's in the public domain. We'll put the link down in the description below. But this is published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1951 and actually had a different title. It was called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
So Bradbury is quoted to say that the idea of this came from when him and his wife were driving down the wreckage of Venice Beach.
Venice Beast. Huh? See what you did there.
I should say Venice Beast. The roller coaster had fallen into the ocean, and he kind of remarked to his wife, "Oh, it looks like the skeletons of a dinosaur." And I believe it was like days later or that night, something like that. He woke up in the middle of the night with fog everywhere, and he heard kind of like the foghorn going off in the distance. And that's what kind of inspired him, according to Ray Bradbury, to what made him write this story.
I think it's very cool inspiration for this. I can imagine and picture that in my head as well.
I really like his plots. He's known for that twist. But what's interesting to me is whenever we do the analysis, it's typically not a full, complete interpretation, allegory, symbolism. It's like thematic elements put into it, and just the tone is really what's remarkable when it comes down to it with Ray.
I think our buddy Ray here is one of those unique writers, like we've seen with others, that allows you to fill in a lot with your own imagination. And I think that's what puts him above all the others in a class of his own.
All right, so for themes, let's cover some 3 themes that we're going to kind of go in an inline analysis, where we're going to kind of give the plot and analysis of each section in line. But we're going to be talking about isolation, communication, and ephemeral versus eternal.
So real quick, before we get into our plot/analysis combo, I want to talk about communication first, because that's probably the most important thing here is, as my wife has told me, that communication is a two-way street. And if one person doesn't hear the other person or interpret it the way that it was intended, then the communication actually hasn't happened. And I got a good quote for us later in the video.
All right, so our story starts out with McDunn and Johnny, who are 2 lighthouse workers, and they work at a stone structure with a loud foghorn. What does fog represent in literature?
That's going to be our isolation centerpiece here.
And there's lots of isolation in the beginning. We have McDunn is isolated at the lighthouse.
Isolated road and these isolated cars of this isolated town. It's beaten over the head. Very, very apparent.
And do you remember what the name of the bay is by chance?
I don't.
Lonesome Bay.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's good. So yeah, I mean, Ray's really trying to be like, hey, pay attention to this.
Well, I think you had a really good point about micro-expressions in the fog, and when you're in a fog, you can't really see other people. You can hear them, but you don't see them.
Yeah, so the micro expressions are, like we have our masks over our face nowadays, and you can't see these micro expressions, and those are a valuable cue of when talking to someone. And if you don't have those, it's going to mask what you know or get or how you're going to talk to somebody, and the fog is doing that throughout the story.
Well, and I think you've pointed out too, communication's a two-way street, right? If I say something to you, you're like, okay, got it. You may not actually have heard it, which means we actually did not communicate. You must receive, in a sense, for communication to happen. And with a mask over your face, we're failing to communicate the visual side of things. With a fog out there, people are missing out on visual sides of communication, at least, right?
Yeah, those are very, very important. And that's why a lot of times people struggle with communication, is because they don't see those facial cues, or they don't see those physical mannerisms. And some people struggle with communicating because they don't know how to give facial cues or mannerisms, or they do them too well, right?
So just the first line of this text: out there in the cold water, far from land. So already we're out, we're cold. We have to eye the lonely ships If they did not see our light, then there was always our voice. So we have a lot of, like you're talking about, we don't have that face-to-face communication and a very lot of out there lonely references in the opening paragraph.
And I think that one thing too that this does, and it sets up nicely, is the tone of the story. And that's one thing that a lot of times can be missing in a communication is your tone. When you're face to face, or when you're talking like on a cell phone or something like that, you can convey your tone very easily. But there are times when you cannot.
So our first line of dialogue, continuing to reinforce this theme, is, "It's a lonely life, but you're used to it now, aren't you?" asked McDunn. "Yes," I said. "You're a good talker, thank the Lord." "Well, it's your turn on land tomorrow," he said, smiling, "to dance the ladies and drink gin. What do you think, McDunn, when I leave you out there here alone?" So again, we're immediately referencing alone, but here's something to be thinking about too. He says you're going to dance and drink gin when he goes on land.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's ironic, I guess, right?
Well, it's his eye. It's his mind is somewhere else. What are you going to be doing over there while I'm alone? Right? It's that projection concept.
Okay, so jealousy then.
Well, next we have the godlight talk where the fish come up, right? And they're looking at this godlight flashing red and white, this herd. What's it called? A school fish. Actually,
that's
small
funny.
point. I just learned, do you know what a group of cats is called?
A coven?
A clouder.
I was close. I was close. I knew it was something like that. I'd actually heard that before, yeah.
But he talks about the fish worshiping the light. And again, this is going to sound strange, but in a weird kind of way, you can almost view worshiping as a solitary activity too, right? It's an outward manifestation where you're hoping to receive or at least give appreciation externally. But for most people, I mean, hey, if you've had a great, profound religious experience, great. But for most people, there's not much backwards information coming. There's not really communication from worship, right?
Most of the time, at least in my personal experience, I've never had any reciprocation from a higher power.
I think that's probably more the average, right? Like not many people are like, yeah, I've heard back from him every day. Like,
yeah, no burning bushes for me, nothing like that. So,
well, and it's also worth pointing out in terms of the other theme, the experience with the fish is ephemeral. It's a one-day activity, while the foghorn is timeless and it represents loneliness. So the loneliness is a timeless experience compared to, with the fish being a temporary thing.
One thing that I thought it was very, very maybe unique here with this part is that he was maybe trying to throw us off a little bit with this and pull in something else, because it does kind of take a left turn here when we get further into the story.
Well, next they talk about how the water is older and it hasn't developed, right? They say, while we've paraded around with trumpets, lopping off each other's countries and heads, they have been living beneath the sea, 12 miles deep and cold in a time as old as the beard on a comet, which is a little bit of a war commentary, and it's also coming back to that time thing.
I think Ray here is hitting the nose on the head that we have not been around that long. Our written history is 12,000 years old, and most of it we've been fighting and killing each other, right? I think here with the ocean, we see that this communication, foreshadowing. So I have a quote here from the story, and it says, "Sounds like an animal, don't it?" McDunn nodded to himself. "A big, lonely animal crying in the night."
So McDunn finally warns Johnny that on this particular night, this foghorn attracts a gigantic monster. This will be the third time the monster has visited the lighthouse, and McDunn tells him that the monster scream sounds exactly like the foghorn.
Ooh, you get goosebumps, right?
Well, a half an hour, this is interesting right here. It says a half hour passed with only a few whispers between us. Isn't this kind of big news? like, hey man, there's this huge monster coming. I get fear, but wouldn't you be talking about, okay, hang on. What do you mean by big sea monster? What are we talking about here? I think this is to reinforce that communication theme, right? Even these two gentlemen that are working together aren't even communicating.
If you came out and said something huge, revolutionary that to me, I'd have a million questions, and they're just kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs, waiting for this monster to come. You figured Johnny'd be a little bit more concerned.
Well, I have an interesting parallel here, too, that I wanted to bring up to you. But there's this paragraph quote here, which I think is probably one of the best quotes in this. But he says, "One day, many years ago, a man walked along and stood in the sound of the ocean on a cold, sunless shore and said, 'We need a voice to call across the water, to warn ships. I'll make one. I'll make a voice that is like an empty bed inside you all night long, and like an empty house, when you open the door, and you like the trees in autumn with no leaves, a sound like the birds flying south crying, and a sound like November wind and the sea on the hard cold shore, I'll make a sound that's so alone that no one can miss it, that whoever hears it will weep in their souls. And to all who hear it in the distant towns, I'll make me a sound and an apparatus, and they'll call it a foghorn, and whoever hears it will know the sadness of eternity and the briefness of life. Which brings in all three of our themes here in this one quote, right? In terms of the loneliness, the communication, the briefness, and the eternal, right here. But also, I was going to point out that this is very biblical, the way it kind of reads. Like, it's kind of like archaic and very intense. Can you name a time in the Bible where communication was kind of unified?
Yeah, it was the first book of the Bible, Genesis.
Yeah, and what was the tower called?
The Tower of Babel.
And how did they build the Tower of Babel?
With stones, right?
Well, I'm assuming it was stones. I was actually going for more, less literal. They built it because they all spoke the same language. They communicated with each other, right? And that's when God came down and said, hey, no. This is not how it's going to work. And guess what happens?
It destroys the tower, and everybody can't communicate and speaks different languages.
So we have a very biblical allusion here, if you will.
Yeah, that paragraph, I think, encapsulates the whole story, and it feels very much like verses of the Bible.
So soon the monster appears. And we have the quote, "It's a dinosaur of some sort." I crouched down, holding to the stair rail. I'm sorry, I had to sneak in the Jurassic Park dinosaur.
I was waiting for that. That's funny.
I think this is kind of the quote where you kind of see some more of that inspiration, where Ray saw the skeleton of the roller coaster from Venice Beach and saw it as a dinosaur.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously had a very good image in his head when he was writing this of what it, would look like, and maybe what somebody would scream if they actually saw a true living giant beast dinosaur rise out of the water. Right. I mean, you wouldn't be like, oh, hey, that's something you don't see every day. You would not be calm, cool, and collective.
Right. Well, it's interesting too, just going back to the ephemeral versus eternal. The dinosaurs are very old, and here they are communicating, again with that theme. But here we have the monster attempting to communicate with this lighthouse, right?
Yeah, so when it comes up out of the water, it slowly, comes towards the lighthouse, thinking it's greeting an old friend, and the lighthouse and the dinosaur are communicating back and forth. At least we're supposed to believe it is, and that's one thing that I thought was really, really unique is it never says, besides that they're blowing, the horns are blowing, what they're actually saying. As the two main characters in the story, the lighthouse and the beast, in my mind anyway, we don't know if they're speaking gibberish or what it is. We don't know what the monster says or the lighthouse says.
So the monster thinks he's found another of his kind, potentially, right? He can finally communicate. He sends out these sounds of loneliness too, right?
Yeah, made a friend. And we have the quote here. McDunn says, "It's been biding its time, perhaps 1,000,000 years old, this one creature. Think of it, waiting 1,000,000 years. Could you wait that long?"
Bringing up time again.
Yeah, and then communication and language and all that. Again, it's kind of an incredible, depressing story a little bit. I mean, 1,000,000 years, a long time.
Well, I think this is the most depressing part of it when he says, "Someone always waiting for someone who never comes home. Always someone loving something more than that thing that loves them." And I think that kind of speaks to the idea of communication in marriages too, right?
Yeah, definitely. And when communication is shut down between two people, what do we happen as a result? Because the next thing in the story is they turn off the foghorn and the monster goes into this rage and destroys the lighthouse.
Stop communicating with me, I'm going to lash out, right?
So to move us kind of to our last point here of communication, I have a very famous quote that was provided to me by my lovely wife, Mrs. Crypto. And this is something that she talks to people about all the time, is a famous quote by George Bernard Shaw. "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." That's pretty deep. That's really deep.
Monster thinks it's found one of its own.
Yeah, it thinks that it can communicate with the lighthouse, and it can't. And it doesn't know that communication has not taken place because it keeps hearing words back, or at least we're led to believe that it does. And then as communication breaks down or does not occur, as you said, it lashes out and destroys the lighthouse.
destroys the Tower of Babel, thus destroying all communication to work together, right?
Yeah. And I think that that's true for most people, animals, things in life. As you communicate and you try and you try and try, eventually you're going to lose your patience and you retaliate some way by physical violence like the beast did, or saying something that you may regret later, but you're going to lash out.
There's a ton of ways to think about this from a modern standpoint, right? In terms of cell phones, you can think about when I text, you're not getting the tone, like we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when we're on the phone calls like this, there's no micro expressions for us to see with one another and communicate. And those are crucial to make sure that communication has happened.
Right. And there's even those themes that, when you're dying, are you going to think back to the time you spent playing games on your phone? Or are you going to think back to the eternal times of when you were hanging out with your friends and have like really memorable and cherishable moments? So a lot of these themes, it's why it can resonate with us, because we get these themes without even like just consciously understanding them. We get the tones, we get the underlying meanings of them. And it's just Ray's ability to really thematically play with the tone and these thematic elements to his story that just it makes it resonate without even being able to articulate, to communicate with why this is hitting you well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's the one kind of thing that is incredible with this story is that it's all about communication, and the two main characters, we don't have any dialogue. There's very little dialogue in the whole story. That's
no dialogue that doesn't include the word lonely, right?
Exactly. So we get to the end of the story, and they rebuild the lighthouse, and Johnny finds a new job, and he moves away and leaves poor McDunn alone with the White House again.
It's learned you can't love anything too much in this world. It's gone into the deepest deeps to wait another 1,000,000 years.
Oh, poor McDunn.
Yeah. All right, so that was kind of like our breakdown in terms of how these thematic elements kind of come out. I think it's really important to talk about communication being two-way. Just because you say something doesn't mean you're heard, according to the famous quote, right?
And without that communication, you're going to feel alone.
All right, so let's move to our subjective ratings of this. We've been traveling through a lot of stories here from Ray Bradbury, and I really, really like what I'm seeing in a lot of these stories. This was a good one for me. I'm going to go, actually, I don't know if this is going to surprise you or not, but I'm going to go with a 7.5 on this one.
I was also thinking about this last night as when we get to this part, what did I want to give it? Did I want to give it a higher or lower? Where was on it? Because I think that it has a really good teachable themes, blah, 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 as we've discussed. But it's not that great of a story. I feel like there are better stories.
It's fun. It's
fun. But it gives me Godzilla, and I'd rather watch Godzilla.
Well, you know what it is we've read a lot of stories where these huge, symbolic, really complete thoughts, right? And Ray Bradbury has this approach where this is left very open-ended. This is thematic plays for how the story brings meaning together, which is really unique, but it may just not be for us as rewarding.
Yeah, I think that I didn't feel as rewarded at the end of the story, especially for some of the other things that we've read of his that I've enjoyed a little bit more. So I'm trying to just critique Ray against himself and not other, I think, better stories of communication that we've done. So I would also give this a solid 7.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Because I did enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, you gave it a 7.
All right.
Me, you, are we failing at communicating right now?
We are. End this video. I communicated with you. The end.
Thank you guys for checking out this video. If you'd like to join us on more literature and Ray Bradbury discussions in the future, please consider hitting that subscribe button to join us. Una out.
Peace.